Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. They say November is when the mountains remember. Today, I'm sharing 10 true disturbing encounters with feral people from deep Appalachia stories, from nurses, photographers, and delivery drivers who ventured too far into the wilderness. These encounters will make you question what's really living in those remote mountain communities. But before we begin, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now, let's begin. I was 29 when this happened, back in November of 2019, driving bread delivery for Wonder Bakery out of Lexington. I'd been working that job for about 8 months, covering the rural routes that took me deep into eastern Kentucky coal country. Most of the other drivers avoided those routes, too much driving for not enough stops, they said, but honestly, I didn't mind the solitude. After my divorce, I needed the quiet time to think, and the mountain roads gave me that. November was always our slowest month. The tourist season was over, fewer diners stayed open when the cold hit, and people just bought less when winter was coming and money got tight. I was actually worried about my hours getting cut, which is why I didn't complain when my supervisor Mike added a new stop to my Tuesday route. Mountain Fresh Market, he called it. The address put it 3 hours deeper into the mountains than I'd ever delivered, but Mike said they'd specifically requested our full product line and were willing to pay premium rates for regular delivery. I should mention that I grew up in these mountains, about 2 counties over from where this happened. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old families that lived way back in the hollers, people who'd been there since before the coal companies, before the logging companies, before anyone kept records of who lived where. She'd always say them with this look on her face, like she was remembering something she didn't want to remember. Some folks just go different when they're left alone too long, she'd tell me. I never really understood what she meant until that November. The first time I drove out to Mountain Fresh Market, I passed through towns I'd never seen before, places that looked like they'd been forgotten for decades. Empty coal company houses with their roofs fallen in, old mining equipment sitting beside the road, rusted and covered in kudzu. Every few miles I'd see a newer trailer or a house that someone was obviously still living in, but mostly it felt like driving through a graveyard of what these mountains used to be. When I finally found the store, I was genuinely surprised. It sat in a little valley surrounded by hills covered in bare November trees, and it looked professional, clean building, fresh paint, working gas pumps, the kind of place you'd expect to find on a main highway, not at the end of a gravel road that barely showed up on GPS. Carol, the owner, came out to meet me before I'd even finished backing up to the loading dock. She was probably in her 50s, wearing clean jeans and a flannel shirt, talking business like she'd been running stores her whole life. What struck me immediately was how busy the place was. Steady stream of customers, all of them carrying expensive hiking gear, the kind of stuff that costs more than most people around here make in a month. They'd pull up in nice SUVs with out-of-state plates, fill up on gas, buy supplies, and head back toward whatever trail system was up in these hills. Carol knew exactly what she wanted from my truck, ordered our complete line of bread products, and paid cash without haggling. After dealing with store managers who couldn't make decisions to save their lives, it was refreshing. The second week, I noticed she'd already sold most of what I'd brought the previous Tuesday. She ordered exactly the same quantities, paid cash again, and seemed to have her inventory figured out to the loaf. That's usually something that takes months to develop, understanding your customer flow that precisely. But Carol had it down from day one. I started paying attention to the customer patterns, and it was consistent, expensive gear. Out-of-state plates, people who clearly had money to spend on outdoor recreation. By my 3rd month making the delivery, I realized this little store in the middle of nowhere was moving more inventory than some shops I delivered to in actual towns. Not just bread, He could see through the windows that she had camping supplies, trail food, electronics, all kinds of outdoor gear. The cash flow had to be substantial, but the location made no sense. Where were all these customers coming from? I started arriving early to my Tuesday deliveries because the drive was so long and I wanted to make sure I could hit my other stops on schedule. That's how I happened to see something that still gives me nightmares. I pulled into the parking area behind Mountain Fresh Market around 10 a.m. instead of my usual 11, and there was activity behind the building I'd never noticed before. A group of maybe 6 or 7 people were unloading gear from the bed of an old pickup truck, hiking boots, camping equipment, expensive camera gear, backpacks that probably cost more than my truck payment. Nothing unusual about that, except these people weren't wearing any clothes, not work clothes, not even underwear. Completely naked and covered head to toe in mud, like they'd been rolling around in the forest for days. But they weren't acting primitive or savage. They were handling the electronics with obvious care, sorting everything into neat piles, checking each piece like they understood exactly how valuable it all was. One of them, a woman with what looked like ritual scars covering her arms and shoulders, was going through each item with the systematic attention of someone conducting inventory. I sat in my truck for a minute, trying to process what I was seeing, when Carol came around the corner and spotted me. She waved like nothing unusual was happening. Like naked, mud-covered people unloading expensive gear was the most normal thing in the world. "Morning, Tom," she called out. "You're early today." "Yeah, sorry," I managed. "Should I come back later?" No problem." She gestured toward the naked people, who had stopped their work and were watching our conversation with an alertness that made my skin crawl. "Those are my suppliers." The way she said it, casual and matter-of-fact, made it worse somehow. Like she was introducing me to her sales team. She walked over to the group, and I could hear her talking to them in a normal tone of voice, giving what sounded like instructions. The woman with the scars nodded and walked back to the truck, returning with a manila folder. She opened it and started flipping through what looked like photographs or flyers, studying each one carefully before looking at the gear they'd unloaded. "Mountain families," Carol explained, walking back toward me. "They bring me things they find in the woods." The woman with the scars held up what I could now see was a missing person flyer, the kind you see posted at trailheads and ranger stations. "Jennifer Martinez, 24, from Atlanta." She read aloud in perfect, unaccented English. "Nice camera equipment." She gestured toward an expensive digital camera and lens kit sitting in one of the sorted piles. Carol made a Paulin's A note in a small notebook and nodded approvingly. That's when it hit me what I was looking at. This wasn't people finding lost gear in the woods. This was something organized, systematic. These naked, mud-covered people were using missing person flyers like a shopping catalog, matching disappeared hikers to the gear they'd brought in. Mountain Fresh Market wasn't just a convenience store. It was a front operation, a place to clean and sell the belongings of people who vanished in these mountains. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but Carol was watching me with the same systematic attention the scarred woman had shown the missing person flyers. "Tom, you look a little shaken up," she said, her voice still friendly but with something else underneath it. "Maybe you need to understand how this really works." She gestured for me to follow her toward the back door of the store, and the naked people fell in behind us without being asked. The back room looked like a professional warehouse operation, metal shelving units full of organized outdoor gear, electronics sorted by brand and condition, camping equipment arranged with retail precision. Carol opened a ledger book sitting on a metal desk and showed me pages of handwritten entries, names, ages, physical descriptions, equipment inventories, and a column marked acquisition dates. "Wonder Bakery isn't just delivering bread, Tom," she said, running her finger down the entries. "Your delivery schedule helps coordinate our operations. When you show up Tuesday mornings, we know exactly when to have fresh inventory processed and ready for distribution." I stared at the ledger, seeing entry after entry. Robert Chen, 31, Rei tent and sleeping bag system. Sarah Kowalski, 26, professional photography equipment. Marcus Thompson, 29, GPS unit and climbing gear. The dates went back months. These mountain families have been living in these hills longer than anyone remembers. Carol continued. "They know every trail, every camping spot, every place someone might stop for the night, and they've developed a very efficient business model." The naked woman with the scars spoke up. "We provide a service. People come here looking for wilderness experiences, authentic encounters with nature. We give them exactly what they're looking for." Her voice was educated, articulate. This wasn't some feral person who'd gone wild in the woods. This was someone who'd chosen this life, this business. "We'd like to expand the operation," Carol said. "I can give you addresses for 15 other locations like this one, spread across Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Virginia. A network of wilderness outfitters serving the outdoor recreation market. You'd be looking at a 40% cut of gross profits from each location. Very good money, Tom. I couldn't find words. The scope of what she was describing, a coordinated network of murder operations disguised as retail, businesses, using bread delivery routes to coordinate timing across multiple states. When I didn't answer immediately, Carol's expression changed. The friendliness was still there, but something colder moved behind her eyes. "That's disappointing," she said. "I was hoping you'd see the opportunity here." She said something to the naked people in what sounded like a language I'd never heard before, and they immediately moved to positions around the room that blocked my access to the door. Not threatening, exactly, but definitely deliberate. The scarred woman opened that manila folder again and pulled out a thick stack of photographs. Pictures of me leaving my apartment, getting coffee at the diner near my route, talking to my ex-wife outside the courthouse after our divorce hearing. Recent pictures, taken with a telephoto lens from concealment. Tom Bradley, 29, divorced, drives for Wonder Bakery. She recited like she was reading from a personnel file. Lives at 847 Elm Street, apartment 4. No immediate family. Ex-wife remarried and moved to Florida. Limited social connections. Carol took the folder and flipped through more photographs. The families are very thorough in their research, Tom. They've been documenting everyone connected to our operation for months. I looked at the pictures and realized these people knew my life better than I did. My routines, my schedule, my relationships. They'd been studying me like scientists studying a lab rat. "You have two choices," Carol said, closing the folder. "You can become a full partner in what we're building here. Help us coordinate the most profitable wilderness tourism operation in Appalachian history." Or, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Looking back now, I tell myself I agreed because I didn't have a choice. Because I was trapped, outmaneuvered by people who'd been planning this longer than I'd been aware they existed. But if I'm being honest, there was a part of me, a small, dark part, that was impressed by the efficiency of what they'd built. Over the next 8 months, I delivered bread to 17 locations across 4 states. Each one was a front for a different community of what Carol called mountain families. Each group specialized in different types of targets: day hikers, overnight campers, hunting parties, families on vacation. My delivery schedule became their coordination system. When I showed up at each location, they knew exactly when to have merchandise ready for processing and distribution. The operation was more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. They had customers who would special order specific types of gear, wealthy collectors who wanted authentic outdoor equipment with provenance. They'd pay premium prices for a camera that belonged to a particular missing photographer or camping gear from a specific family that had disappeared. The missing person flyers weren't just inventory lists, they were catalogs for customers with very specific tastes. I learned that the naked, mud-covered appearance was camouflage. When hikers encountered them in the woods, they saw exactly what they expected to see: primitive people living wild, maybe mentally ill, definitely harmless. No one reported naked, muddy people as threatening, but underneath that facade were educated, organized professionals who turned the isolation of Appalachian wilderness into the perfect hunting ground. The communities weren't just connected to each other, they'd infiltrated local businesses, law enforcement, even federal agencies. Park rangers who steered hiking groups towards certain areas. Sheriff's deputies who filed missing person reports with strategic delays. Search and rescue volunteers who knew exactly where not to look. I tried once to document everything I'd learned, thinking I could go to state police or the FBI. But the next week, Carol showed me photographs of myself in a Don Villient, the restaurant with a federal agent, writing in a notebook during what I'd thought was a private conversation. They'd been watching me plan my betrayal before I'd even decided to betray them. "Tom, these families have been surviving in these mountains since before there were police to call," Carol told me. "They've learned to be very careful about who they trust." The real horror wasn't the killing or even the systematic nature of it. The real horror was discovering how many people were involved, how far the network reached, how long it had been operating. Missing persons cases going back decades, all connected to a business model that turned human beings into inventory and the wilderness into a shopping mall for people with very specific appetites. My breaking point came 8 months into my involvement, on a Tuesday in July. I arrived at Mountain Fresh Market to find Carol waiting with a familiar manila folder. She opened it to show me a missing person flyer with a face I recognized: Jamie Peterson, a guy I'd gone to high school with, who'd moved to Colorado after graduation. The flyer said he'd been hiking solo in eastern Kentucky and hadn't been heard from in 3 days. He had excellent gear, Carol said matter-of-factly. Professional-grade camping equipment, GPS units, satellite communicator, very valuable. She showed me photographs of Jamie's equipment being sorted by the naked families, and that's when I understood that this wasn't random. They weren't just taking opportunities as they came. They were actively hunting people I knew, people from my past, because I was connected to the operation. "We thought you'd appreciate the personal touch," Carol explained. "The families like to work with items that have emotional significance for their business partners." Jamie's camping gear was sitting in neat piles in the back room, tagged and priced for distribution to collectors who specifically requested equipment from people who'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His GPS unit still had our high school track team sticker on it. That night, I called in sick and drove straight to the state police barracks in Frankfort, 3 hours away from my regular route. I told a detective everything: the delivery schedule, the locations, the mountain families, the missing persons network. He listened carefully, took detailed notes, and assured me they'd investigate immediately. The next Tuesday, Carol was waiting for me with a different kind of folder. Photographs of me in the state police barracks. Audio recordings of my conversation with the detective. Video of me driving to Frankfurt, taken from multiple angles by cameras I'd never noticed. "Detective Morrison is a good man," Carol said. "Honest, dedicated, really wants to help. Unfortunately, he's about to have some personal problems that will require his full attention." She showed me more photographs. Detective Morrison's house. His car in his driveway, his wife leaving for work, his daughter walking to school. "Tom, I need you to understand something," Carol continued, her voice still friendly but with an edge that made my hands shake. "The families don't just hunt in the wilderness. They can adapt to any environment when they need to." The detective's investigation disappeared into bureaucratic delays and jurisdictional confusion. Missing files, corrupted computer records, witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. Detective Morrison requested a transfer to another department and stopped returning my phone calls. I still drive the route today because I've learned exactly what happens to people who try to leave this business. The network Carol showed me 8 months ago was just the beginning. They've expanded into 6 more states, opened new front operations, recruited more families from deeper in the mountains. Last month, Carol told me they're processing an average of 12 disappearances per week across the entire network. The thing that keeps me awake isn't just what I've seen or what I've been forced to help coordinate. It's knowing that every missing person report from Appalachian wilderness areas, every hiker who never came home, every family camping trip that ended in tragedy, there's a systematic business operation behind it. And it's growing. They've started recruiting from outside the mountain families now. People like me, who got pulled in gradually and can't get out. Truck drivers, park employees, local business owners, anyone whose regular activities can provide cover for their operations. Each new recruit expands their capabilities, gives them access to new hunting grounds, new methods of identifying targets. I keep delivering bread every Tuesday because I know what happened to Jamie, and I know what will happen to anyone else I care about if I try to run. But I also know that every week I don't run, more people disappear into a business model that's turned the most beautiful wilderness in America into a hunting preserve for people who've learned to see other human beings as nothing more than walking gear catalogs. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother knew about the mountain families when she told me those stories. If she was trying to warn me about something that had been going on in these hills longer than anyone wanted to remember. She always said some folks go different when they're left alone too long. Now I know she was wrong about one thing. They didn't go different because they were left alone. They went different because they chose to. I'm 30 years old, and I've been working as a visiting nurse for Appalachian Health Services in eastern Tennessee for the past 8 months. The job isn't glamorous, driving rutted mountain roads to check on elderly and disabled folks who live so far back in the hollers that GPS gives up halfway there. But I grew up in these mountains, and after my divorce left me needing steady work, it felt right to help people who reminded me of my own grandparents. November is always our busiest time. Flu season means making rounds to give shots and wellness checks before winter really sets in. Some of these folks won't see another soul until the snow melts, so we have to make sure they're stocked up on medications and know what to watch for if they get sick. I'd been doing this work long enough to know which patients would have coffee ready and which ones would meet me at the door with a shotgun until they recognized my face. That Tuesday morning, my supervisor handed me a file I'd never seen before. "Robert Miller," she said. 65, diabetic, hasn't had any medical care in over a year. Lives way up in Thorn Valley. I'd never heard of Thorn Valley, but the address on my GPS showed it was nearly 4 hours into the mountains. The photo in Miller's medical file showed a pleasant-looking man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. According to his records, he was a retired high school English teacher who'd moved to the mountains for his health about 2 years ago. His emergency contact was listed as none. The drive took me deeper into the backcountry than I'd been since I was a kid. Past the last gas station, past the last cell tower, up roads that weren't much more than logging trails carved between walls of pine and oak. My Honda wasn't built for this kind of terrain, but mountain driving was in my blood, so I took it slow and steady. What struck me first about Miller's place was how well maintained it looked. Most of our isolated patients lived in old trailers or cabins that were falling apart, but this was a solid log home with new solar panels and a satellite dish. There was even a neat vegetable garden and what looked like a workshop out back. Someone was clearly taking good care of the property. A man who matched the photo exactly answered my knock. Same gray hair, same glasses, same gentle expression. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and blue jeans that looked like they'd been pressed. "You must be the nurse from AHS," he said in a cultured voice that matched his background as an educator. "I've been expecting you. Please, come in out of the cold." The interior was immaculate. Hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves lined with classic literature, comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. Everything you'd expect from a retired English teacher with good taste. Miller gestured toward the kitchen table, where he'd already set out 2 coffee cups and a plate of store-bought cookies. "I hope you don't mind the instant coffee," he said, pouring hot water from a kettle. "I don't get to town very often for the good stuff." I started my usual routine while we made small talk. Blood pressure cuff, digital thermometer, glucose meter. But as I worked, something began bothering me. Miller's vital signs weren't just good, they were perfect. Blood pressure, 120/80, resting heart rate exactly 60, blood sugar right at 95. Numbers like that would be impressive for a healthy 30-year-old, let alone a diabetic in his 60s. "These readings are remarkable," I told him as I entered the data on my tablet. "What's your secret?" Miller smiled, but there was something rehearsed about the expression. "Clean living, I suppose. Mountain air, good water, no stress." "What about your diabetes management? Medication? Diet?" "Oh, I've been feeling much better lately. Hardly need the insulin anymore." That should have been a red flag. Type 1 diabetics don't just stop needing insulin. But Miller seemed so pleasant and articulate that I found myself wanting to believe him. We talked about his garden, his reading habits, how he was adjusting to mountain life. Normal conversation, except for the questions he kept weaving in about my other patients. "I imagine you see a lot of folks out this way," he said, refilling my coffee cup. "A fair number. I'd love to know more about my neighbors. You know how it is in these mountains, we look out for each other. The Henderson place over on Copper Creek, for instance. I heard old Frank has heart trouble. Does he live alone out there?" Patient confidentiality meant I couldn't share details, but Miller kept pressing gently. "Where did I go after his appointment? How many people were on my route? Did any of my patients live completely alone with no family checking on them? I like to know who's around," he explained when I deflected his questions. "In case someone needs help." The conversation was making me increasingly uncomfortable, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Miller was polite, even charming, but something about his speech patterns felt off. Too formal, too careful, like he was translating everything in his head before speaking. That's when I started really looking at him, instead of just listening. In the bright kitchen lighting, I hadn't noticed anything unusual. But when we moved to the living room and he positioned himself near a dim table lamp, I could see lines around his neck and wrists. Not scars, these were too precise, too uniform. They looked almost like kind of seams. At first I thought maybe he'd had some kind of reconstructive surgery, but the lines were perfectly straight and seemed to follow the natural boundaries where different skin tones might meet. Like someone had very carefully joined pieces that didn't quite match. When Miller noticed me staring, he shifted deeper into the shadows. "Bright light bothers my eyes," he said, but I noticed he wasn't squinting or showing any other signs of photosensitivity. I made an excuse about needing to check my medication supplies and stepped outside. The November air was crisp and clean after the stuffiness of the cabin. I took a few deep breaths and tried to shake off my unease. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe the long drive and the strange questions had put me on edge for no good reason. I walked around to my car to get the flu vaccine from my cooler, and that's when I decided to take a quick look at the rest of Miller's property. Just curious about how someone maintained such a nice place so far from civilization. Behind the cabin, I found 3 clotheslines strung between tall pine trees. The first line had normal laundry, sheets, towels, work clothes drying in the mountain breeze, but the second and third lines. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Hanging alongside the regular laundry were other things that looked like skin, human skin, carefully cleaned and stretched, drying like pelts. There were faces, recognizable faces, arms and hands, sections of back and chest, all preserved with what looked like expert taxidermy techniques. I recognized one immediately. Sarah Chen, the young hiker whose missing person flyers had been posted all over town for the past month. Her face hung there like a Halloween mask, eyes and mouth carefully stitched closed. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." I spun around to find Miller standing about 10 feet behind me, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't the same cultured tone from inside. This was flat, mechanical, like something imitating human speech without understanding its rhythm or cadence. "The outer coverings are necessary for integration," he continued in that same emotionless voice. "Your species responds poorly to our natural appearance." As I watched in frozen horror, Miller reached up and began peeling off what I had thought was his face. It came away in one piece like a latex mask, revealing something pale and smooth underneath. What I had taken for kind eyes were actually dark holes in featureless white skin. Where his mouth had been was a circular opening filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Robert Miller provided excellent base material," the thing said, examining the human face in its elongated fingers. "Isolated location, established medical history, no social connections to investigate inconsistencies. We observed his patterns for 4 months before replacement." The workshop behind the cabin suddenly made sense. Through the open door, I could see tables covered with tools, not woodworking tools, but surgical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, industrial needles, and thread. Everything needed for careful skinning and preservation. The previous inhabitant was uncooperative during the harvesting process. It continued conversationally. But his skin fits adequately, though the facial musculature requires constant, conscious control. Other figures emerged from the cabin and the workshop. What had appeared to be a small community of mountain folk were revealed as more of these creatures wearing ill-fitting human disguises. An elderly woman whose face was clearly too small for her skull. A middle-aged man whose hands were obviously from a different person than his arms. A teenager whose skin looked like it had been pieced together from multiple sources, creating a patchwork of different skin tones and textures. "We require assistance with donor selection," the Miller thing said, producing a manila folder. "Your access to isolated subjects makes you valuable." Inside the folder were photocopied medical files, my patient records. Photos, addresses, medical conditions, family situations, everything I had refused to discuss earlier, somehow obtained from our secure database. Optimal harvesting requires healthy subjects with minimal social connections. Another creature, explained in a voice that sounded exactly like my supervisor back at the office. "Your medical assessment capabilities would improve selection efficiency." Quality preservation demands proper preparation, added a third, speaking in the voice of my ex-husband. A voice these things should have had no way of knowing. Subjects must be isolated, sedated, and processed, while circulatory systems remain functional. They showed me more files. Not just my current patients, but people from neighboring counties, hikers who had disappeared, hunters who never came home, elderly folks who had simply vanished from their remote cabins. All carefully cataloged with notes about skin quality, muscle tone, and preservation potential. Your cooperation ensures optimal results, the Miller thing said. Resistance results in immediate processing for personal material requirements. When I told them I would never help them hurt people, their human masks began to slip, literally. Skin started to loosen and sag as the things underneath abandoned any pretense of humanity. What emerged defied description. Pale, elongated forms with too many joints in their arms and legs. Fingers that split into smaller digits like branching twigs. Those circular mouths full of rows of teeth designed not for chewing, but for efficient flesh removal. They moved with an insect-like quality, all sharp angles and mechanical precision. Processing will commence immediately, the leader announced, and they began closing in with inhuman coordination. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush toward my car while these things pursued me with terrifying efficiency. They moved through the forest like spiders, using their multiple jointed limbs to navigate obstacles that should have slowed them down. Behind me, I could hear them calling out in the voices of everyone I had ever known. My mother, my sister, my college roommate, my first boyfriend, voices they had somehow stolen or recorded or learned, promising they would make it quick if I would just stop running. My Honda started on the first try, and I floored it down that mountain track without caring about the rocks and ruts that scraped against the undercarriage. In my rearview mirror, I watched them keep pace with my car for the first mile, running alongside like wolves before finally falling behind as the road straightened out. I drove straight to the sheriff's department, but when deputies went to investigate the next morning, they found nothing. No cabin, no solar panels, no workshop full of surgical tools. Just empty forest that county records showed had been undeveloped for decades. The missing person case for Sarah Chen remained open, but the deputies made it clear they thought I'd suffered some kind of breakdown from the stress of working alone in isolated areas. I quit nursing that same week and moved to North Carolina, but the harassment didn't stop. Every few months, I received medical files in the mail. Patient records for people who don't exist, with addresses that lead to empty lots or abandoned buildings. Appointment requests signed in my own handwriting, in the handwriting I don't remember making. The envelopes always smell faintly of preservatives and something else. Something organic and wrong that makes my stomach turn. I never open them anymore, but I can feel them watching, waiting to see if I'll change my mind about their offer. Last month, I saw a news report about a visiting nurse who disappeared while making rounds in the mountains of West Virginia. Jennifer Martinez, 28, last seen driving toward an appointment with a new patient named Thomas Richardson. A patient whose medical records showed he was a 62-year-old retired librarian with no family. The photo they showed looked exactly like the kind of pleasant, harmless old man that any nurse would feel safe visiting alone. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That somewhere in those mountains, things are wearing our skin and learning how we live, studying our patterns so they can replace us more efficiently. That they're using our own healthcare system to identify the most vulnerable targets? Instead, I sent Jennifer's family a card with my condolences and tried to forget about the whole thing. But every time I see a missing person report from Appalachia, I wonder if somewhere out there, someone is hanging their face on a clothesline to dry. To this day, I won't drive into the mountains alone, and I've never practiced nursing again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that mechanical voice explaining how the outer coverings are necessary for integration. And I know they're still out there, wearing our faces, waiting for the next healthcare worker naive enough to make a house call in the deep woods. Back when I was 32, I worked for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, doing population surveys in the remote parts of Daniel Boone National Forest. It was November 2019, and I'd been assigned to document wildlife recovery in areas that had been strip-mined decades earlier. The work meant spending weeks alone in places where most people hadn't set foot since the coal companies pulled out in the 70s. I'd grown up hunting these mountains with my grandfather, so the isolation never bothered me. What I found out there, though, I still wake up some nights thinking about those pale, watching eyes. The assignment was straightforward enough. Hike into Wolf Creek Hollow, set up trail cameras, document any deer, elk, or bear sign, and file a report on habitat recovery. The hollow had been gutted by strip mining back in 1967, then abandoned when the coal seam played out. 50 years of regrowth should have made it prime territory for wildlife, but the preliminary flyovers showed almost no animal activity. My supervisor, Janet, figured maybe the old mining equipment was still leaching chemicals into the soil, scaring animals away. "Probably nothing," she'd said, handing me the GPS coordinates. "But we need to document it for the federal report." I drove my truck as far as I could up an old logging road, then hiked the last 3 miles into the hollow carrying my gear. The forest felt wrong from the moment I left the truck. I've spent my whole life in these mountains, and you develop an instinct for how a healthy forest should sound and smell. This place was too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects humming. Even the wind seemed muffled. The trees were healthy enough, thick stands of oak and maple with dense understory, but it felt like walking through a movie set instead of living wilderness. I set up my base camp near what used to be a mining foreman's shack, just a concrete foundation and some rusted machinery half buried in decades of fallen leaves. The trail cameras went up easy enough, one covering a game trail that ran along the creek, another watching a natural salt lick, and a third monitoring the only decent access route into the hollow. Standard protocol called for checking the cameras every 3 days and staying in the field for 2 weeks unless I found something that needed immediate reporting. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds that weren't quite right, footsteps that stopped when I listened for them, branches breaking in patterns that didn't match wind or animal movement. I've been camping alone since I was a teenager, and I know the difference between normal night sounds and something else. This was something else. The second day, I found the bones. I was following deer sign along the creek bed when I came across a scatter of white bones in a small clearing about 50 yards from the water. At first glance, they looked like a deer. Kill ribs, vertebrae, a skull with the distinctive eye sockets. But when I knelt down to examine them closer, the proportions were wrong. The skull was too large, the leg bones too long and thin. The way they were arranged wasn't random either, like you'd expect from a predator kill or natural death. They'd been placed in a rough circle, with the skull in the center facing toward the old mining operation. I took photos and GPS coordinates, thinking maybe it was some kind of folk art installation or hunting ritual I wasn't familiar with. But when I tried to pick up the skull to examine it better, my hands started shaking. The bone was too light, too smooth, and there were marks on it that looked like tool scrapes, but in places where no butcher would need to cut. I left everything where I found it and hiked back to camp, telling myself I was being paranoid. That night, I heard them talking. I was lying in my sleeping bag around midnight when voices drifted through the trees, from somewhere up the ridge. At first, I thought maybe other hikers had gotten lost and were trying to navigate in the dark, so I called out, offering help. The voices stopped immediately, and the forest went dead silent. After about 10 minutes, they started up again, but closer now. Much closer. They weren't speaking English. It wasn't Spanish or any native language I'd heard either. The sounds were too harsh, too guttural, with clicking noises that didn't fit any human speech pattern I knew. But underneath the alien rhythm, I could hear something that made my skin crawl. They were mimicking human conversation patterns. The rise and fall of questions and answers, the pauses where laughter should go, the rhythm of people talking over each other. It was like listening to someone who'd learned to speak by watching humans from a distance, but had never actually understood what the words meant. I grabbed my flashlight and service pistol, but I didn't leave the tent. Something about those voices told me that showing myself would be a mistake I wouldn't survive. I lay there listening as they moved around my camp in a wide circle, always staying just outside the range of my light. They were studying me, I realized, learning my routines, my equipment, my reactions. Around 3 in the morning, they started laughing. It began as a low chuckling that could almost pass for human amusement, but it went on too long and got too loud. More voices joined in until the whole hollow echoed with this horrible, gleeful cackling that seemed to bounce off every tree and rock. It wasn't joyful laughter, it was the sound of predators who'd found something amusing about their prey. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke, I found footprints around my camp. They were almost human, but wrong in subtle ways that made my stomach turn. Too narrow, with toes that were too long and spread too wide. The heel marks were deep and the stride was longer than any the person should have been able to manage. Worst of all, they circled my camp exactly 13 times. I counted. Whatever had made them had been watching me for hours, walking the same path over and over while I lay helpless in my tent. I should have packed up right then, should have hiked back to my truck and driven straight to the ranger station. But I was a professional, and I had a job to finish. I told myself that feral people, wild humans who'd been living rough for generations, weren't uncommon in remote areas of Appalachia. Moonshiners' families who'd gone completely off-grid, maybe, or descendants of people who'd fled into the mountains during the Depression and never came back out. Strange, sure, but not necessarily dangerous. I checked my trail cameras that morning, hoping to get some footage of whatever had visited me. The memory cards were gone. Not damaged or corrupted, completely removed from all 3 cameras. Professional equipment worth thousands of dollars, and someone had picked the locks without damaging the cases, extracted the cards, and sealed everything back up. That level of technical skill didn't match with the primitive behavior I'd witnessed. I spent the rest of that day documenting plant life and soil samples, trying to maintain some sense of normal routine. But I kept feeling watched, and every time I turned around, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Pale shapes that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. By afternoon, I'd started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence, and I noticed that whenever I spoke, the feeling of being observed intensified. They were learning from me. Learning how humans moved, how we sounded, how we behaved when we thought we were alone. That evening, I decided to try something. Instead of hiding in my tent, I built a large fire and sat beside it, making myself visible and vulnerable. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped acting like prey. Within an hour, they started emerging from the tree line. At first, they were just shadows at the edge of my firelight, tall, thin shapes that moved with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic. As they grew bolder, stepping closer to the light, I could make out more details. They looked human, but like humans who'd been stretched and twisted by generations of isolation and inbreeding. Their limbs were too long for their bodies, their faces too narrow, their eyes too large and reflective in the firelight. They wore clothes of a sort crude garments stitched together from animal hides and scraps of fabric that might have been scavenged from abandoned mining camps. But their hair was long and matted, and their fingernails had grown into claw-like points. They moved in absolute silence, communicating through hand gestures and facial expressions that seemed too complex and subtle for their primitive appearance. The largest of them, a gaunt figure who might once have been a man, stepped into the full light of my fire. When he opened his mouth, I saw that his teeth had been filed into points. He began to speak, and I realized with horror that he was mimicking my voice, not just the words I'd spoken during the day, but my exact intonation and accent. "Professional equipment worth thousands of dollars," he said in my voice. "I should have packed up right then." He tilted his head at an impossible angle, studying my reaction. I told myself that feral people weren't uncommon in remote areas. The others began joining in, creating a chorus of my own words thrown back at me in perfect imitation. They'd been listening to everything I'd said, every phone call I'd made to check in with Janet, every muttered curse when my equipment malfunctioned. But they were recombining the phrases randomly, like children playing with sounds they didn't understand. I realized they weren't just feral humans. They were something that had been human once, maybe generations ago, but had changed into something else entirely, something that survived by studying and mimicking the people who wandered into their territory. The bone circle I'd found wasn't art, it was a learning tool. They'd been practicing human anatomy, figuring out how we were built so they could better pretend to be us. The leader stepped closer, and I could see that his eyes weren't quite human anymore. The irises were too pale, almost white, and they reflected light like an animal's. When he smiled with those filed teeth, I understood that he wasn't trying to communicate with me. He was testing how well he could replicate human facial expressions. "I've spent my whole life in these mountains," he said in my voice, practicing the emotional inflection I'd used when talking to myself about feeling unsettled. Something about those voices told me that showing myself would be a mistake I wouldn't survive. They were planning to replace me, to study me until they could perfectly replicate my behavior, then take my place in the world outside their hollow. The missing trail cameras, the circling footprints, the careful observation, it was all preparation for an elaborate deception that would let them infiltrate human society. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was sitting by the fire, transfixed by their horrible mimicry, and the next I was sprinting through the dark forest with my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing, not running like humans would, but moving through the trees with that same fluid grace, barely disturbing the underbrush. They were hurting me. I realized it when I found myself back at the bone circle, even though I'd been running in what I thought was a straight line toward my truck. They'd been guiding my escape route, cutting off certain paths and leaving others open, driving me toward this clearing like I was a deer they were hunting. The leader emerged from the tree line, no longer bothering to mimic human posture. He moved like something that had learned to walk upright but preferred to crawl. "I don't remember making the decision to run," he said in my voice, and the others laughed with my own laughter. That's when I understood the real horror of what they were doing. It wasn't just that they wanted to replace me, they were already starting to become me. Every word I'd spoken, every gesture I'd made, every emotional response they'd witnessed was being absorbed and integrated into their behavior. They were learning to be human by consuming human personalities, and I was just the latest in a long line of people who'd wandered into their territory and never left. I pulled out my pistol, but before I could fire, something heavy struck me from behind. The last thing I remember was falling face first into that circle of bones, thinking that I was about to become part of their anatomical studies. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Corbin. A couple of hikers had found me on the logging road near my truck, dehydrated and hypothermic but otherwise unharmed. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, and my gear was neatly packed in the truck bed like I'd broken camp in an orderly fashion. The trail cameras were back in their cases, memory cards intact, and showing nothing but normal forest footage: deer, a few squirrels, some raccoons. Janet said I'd called in sick on day 4 of the assignment, reporting that I'd come down with food poisoning and needed to cut the survey short. The call had come from my own satellite phone, and the voice had been mine. But I have no memory of making that call, and when I checked my phone records later, the call had lasted 17 minutes, much longer than a simple sick report should have taken. The doctors said I'd probably gotten disoriented and confused due to dehydration, maybe hit my head on a branch while hiking out. Mild concussion, they suggested, which would explain the memory loss. But I know what really happened in that hollow, even if I can't prove it. Someone else made that phone call. Someone who'd learned to sound exactly like me. I never filed a report about what I'd found. How could I? But I did some research on Wolf Creek Hollow, digging through old mining company records and local newspaper archives. Turns out, people had been disappearing in that area for over 50 years. Hikers, hunters, survey crews like mine, they'd go in and never come out, or they'd emerge days later with no memory of what had happened and strange gaps in their timelines. The mining company records were even more disturbing. In 1967, just before they abandoned the operation, several miners reported finding wild families living in the deep shafts and tunnels. Children who'd never seen sunlight, parents who spoke in strange dialects that company translators couldn't identify. The mining foreman recommended sealing the tunnels and forgetting what they'd found, which is exactly what the company did. I think those families never left. I think they adapted to their underground environment, generation after generation, until they became something that was no longer quite human. And I think they've been studying surface dwellers ever since, learning to mimic us well enough to walk among us undetected. I requested a transfer to a different district after my recovery, and I've never gone back to Daniel Boone National Forest. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from my own number. When I answer, I hear my own voice on the other end, speaking words I've never said but in my exact tone and accent. The conversations never make complete sense. Fragments of reports I've filed, pieces of conversations with coworkers, random observations about wildlife I've encountered. They're still learning from me, somehow. still perfecting their imitation. The worst part is, I've started recognizing other voices in those calls. Janet from Fish and Wildlife, whose retirement party I attended last month, even though she seemed different, somehow quieter, more careful in her speech. A park ranger named Mike, who went missing during a solo patrol 3 years ago, but supposedly turned up safe with no memory of where he'd been. A dozen other people I know professionally who've had unexplained gaps in their work history or personality changes that everyone attributed to stress or age. I don't think they're human anymore. I think they're something else wearing human faces, infiltrating our communities one person at a time. And the most terrifying part is how good they're getting at it. How perfectly they can mimic not just our voices and mannerisms, but our memories, our relationships, our entire lives. I've thought about going public, but who would believe me? And besides, how would I know which officials I was reporting to were actually human? How would I know that the person taking my statement wasn't one of them, learning everything I know about their operation? So I keep quiet, and I keep watching, and I try to spot the subtle signs that someone isn't quite right. The way they hold their head when listening, the slight delay before they laugh at jokes, the tendency to speak in phrases that sound like combinations of things other people have said. Most of the time, the people around me seem normal, but not always. And every time I catch one of those small wrongnesses, I wonder if I'm looking at someone who used to be human, or something that learned to be human by studying someone like me in a place like Wolf Creek Hollow. I wonder how many of us are left, and I wonder if, someday soon, I'll get a phone call from someone who sounds exactly like me, telling me it's time to come home to the hollow where I belong, where I've always belonged, where the bone circles are waiting to teach me what it really means to be human. I was 28 when I started working as a home health aide for Appalachian Community Care. Honestly, it wasn't my first choice for a career. But after my dad got sick and I saw how much the home health nurses helped our family, I figured maybe I could do some good too. The pay wasn't much, but it covered my rent in a little apartment outside Beckley, and I liked the idea of helping people who couldn't always get to a doctor on their own. Most of my patients were elderly folks living way back in the mountains, people whose families had been on the same land for generations. November was always our busiest time. Everyone needed checkups before winter set in, and the roads got too bad to travel. Some of these places, you couldn't reach them for months once the snow started falling heavy. My supervisor, Janet, called me on a Tuesday morning with a new assignment. "Got a patient for you up in Deer Hollow?" she said. "Name's Robert Chen, 45 years old, recovering from a traumatic brain injury. The doctor up there specifically requested someone with your experience level." I remember thinking it was odd to have someone with a Chinese last name way up in those mountains, but people move around, right? Janet gave me the address and said Dr. Mitchell would be expecting me around 2 o'clock. The drive would take about 2 hours, winding up through some pretty remote country. I loaded my medical bag into my Honda and headed out. The first hour was normal enough. Main highways through small towns, past old coal processing plants and newer gas stations. But once I turned off onto the mountain roads, things got quieter. The trees pressed in close on both sides, and I passed maybe 3 houses in the last 30 minutes of driving. My GPS kept recalculating the route, which wasn't unusual up there. Cell towers were spotty in the mountains, and sometimes the satellites couldn't get a good read through all that tree cover. But when I finally found the address, I had to double-check the numbers on my paperwork. Instead of a house or a cabin like I was expecting, I was looking at what appeared to be some kind of medical facility. It was a long, low building made of tan brick with a parking lot and everything. There were maybe 8 cars parked outside, and the whole place looked professional and well-maintained. I figured maybe Mr. Chen was in some kind of specialized rehabilitation center. Dr. Sarah Mitchell met me at the front door before I even had a chance to knock. She was probably in her 50s, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a white lab coat over business casual clothes. Very professional, very welcoming. "You must be from Appalachian Community Care," she said, extending her hand for a shake. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. Thank you so much for making the drive up here." She led me through a reception area that looked like any medical office. Chairs along the walls, magazines on side tables, that antiseptic smell you get in hospitals. Robert is part of an innovative rehabilitation program we're running here, she explained as we walked down a hallway lined with doors. We help people with severe social dysfunction integrate back into society after traumatic events. I nodded along, though something about the way she said social dysfunction struck me as odd. In my experience, brain injury patients usually had issues with memory, motor skills, speech, our program specifically. Here's what makes our program unique, Doctor. Mitchell continued, stopping outside a door marked with the number 12. We've discovered that many psychological traumas stem from the artificial constraints of modern civilization. Our treatment involves stripping away harmful social programming and helping patients rediscover their natural human behavioral patterns. She opened the door, and I got my first look at Robert Chen. The man sitting on the bed looked wild. His black hair hung down to his shoulders, matted and tangled like he hadn't brushed it in months. There were what looked like ritual scars along his arms, deliberate cuts that had healed into raised marks. He was naked except for a hospital gown that hung open in the back, and when he looked up at us, his eyes had an intensity that made me want to step backwards. But then Dr. Mitchell spoke to him, and everything got much weirder. How are you feeling today, Robert? Any changes in cognitive function? Robert's response came out in perfect medical terminology, delivered in a flat, mechanical tone. Cognitive integration proceeding as programmed, Dr. Mitchell. Synaptic reconfiguration remains within acceptable parameters. I've worked with brain injury patients before, and this wasn't how they talked. This sounded like he was reciting from a textbook or reading off a script. Dr. Mitchell smiled and made a note on her clipboard. Excellent progress. Robert was a software engineer before his breakdown, she explained to me. The rehabilitation program is designed to preserve intellectual capacity while removing the psychological barriers that were causing his distress. I started taking Robert's vital signs, blood pressure, pulse, temperature. Trying to focus on my job and not think too hard about what I was seeing. But the whole time, Robert stared at me with that unnaturally intense focus, like he was studying me. New person, he said suddenly, still looking at me but directing his words to Dr. Mitchell. Should we process new person? Dr. Mitchell laughed, but it didn't sound entirely comfortable. Not today, Robert. She's here to help. Process new person. I kept thinking about that phrase while I finished up Robert's checkup. What did that mean, exactly? Would you like to see more of our facility? Doctor, Mitchell asked as we left Robert's room. I think you'd find our approach quite revolutionary. I should have said no, should have finished my paperwork and driven straight back down the mountain. But I was curious, and Dr. Mitchell seemed so professional and confident. So I followed her down the hallway. She showed me room after room, each one containing a patient in various stages of what she called rehabilitation. There was a woman who'd apparently been a high school teacher, now wearing animal skins and sitting cross-legged on the floor. A man who'd been a police officer, practicing what looked like tracking techniques by following scent trails around his room. Each patient retains their original intelligence and professional skills, Dr. Mitchell explained as we walked. But we've successfully removed the social conditioning that was preventing them from accessing their authentic human nature. In one room, I watched a former nurse explaining human anatomy to other patients, but she was pointing out vulnerable spots, pressure points, places where you could disable someone quickly and quietly. In another room, an ex-military officer was coordinating what looked like group tactics for. I didn't want to think about what for. The beauty of our program, Dr. Mitchell continued, is that we're creating individuals who can function with their full intellectual capacity while operating on pure instinct. No more anxiety, no more depression, no more social fears. Just efficient, authentic human behavior. I was starting to get a really bad feeling about this whole place. How do people end up in your program? I asked. Doctor. Mitchell's smile got wider. We target individuals suffering from the psychological damage of modern life. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, social isolation, people who are in pain because they're trying to force themselves into unnatural social structures. We offer them a cure. She led me to her office and showed me before and after photos. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, all looking normal and professional in the before pictures. In the after photos, they looked like Robert. Wild, scarred, with that same intense predatory focus in their eyes. Patients enter our program voluntarily, she said. They're seeking relief from the pain of civilized existence. What they discover is that removing social programming creates perfect human beings, hunters who can track, capture, and process new candidates for the program. The room felt like it was getting smaller. Process new candidates? We've been expanding quite successfully. Your medical background would be invaluable for our growth phase. Doctor. Mitchell leaned back in her chair, still smiling. I'd like to offer you a position as head of patient integration. I think I should probably head back, I said, standing up quickly. My supervisor is expecting a report, and it's getting late. Doctor. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but she made some kind of gesture toward the door. When I turned around, Robert Chen was standing there, along with 2 other patients I recognized, from the rooms we'd visited. Perhaps you'd prefer to experience our program from a patient perspective, Dr. Mitchell said calmly. Your social conditioning is clearly causing you significant distress. We can help you find peace through authentic human existence. The 3 patients moved to block the doorway, and they moved with coordinated precision, like they'd done this before. Robert grabbed my arm, while Dr. Mitchell opened a desk drawer and pulled out a syringe. Integration begins with chemical suppression of civilized neural pathways, she explained, approaching me with the needle. Don't worry, you'll retain all your medical knowledge. You'll just be free from the psychological constraints that are making you unhappy. I twisted away from Robert and shoved past the other 2 patients. I could hear Dr. Mitchell calling out behind me, but I was already running down the hallway toward the exit. The patients were following me, but they weren't running the way normal people run. They moved like animals, making these hunting calls to each other, coordinating their pursuit. I could hear them behind me, getting closer. I made it to my car and got the engine started just as they reached the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing there, watching me drive away, not chasing anymore, but just studying how I moved, how my car operated. I drove straight to the state police barracks and told them everything. They took my statement seriously enough to send officers up to investigate, but when they got to the address I'd given them, there was nothing there. Just an empty lot with some old foundation stones, like a building had been torn down years ago. 3 months later, I was watching the local news when I saw Dr. Sarah Mitchell being interviewed about a new wilderness therapy program she was launching. She was standing in front of a different building, in a different part of the mountains, talking about helping people reconnect with their authentic selves. Behind her, I could see some of her staff members. I recognized the former police officer and the ex-military guy. And in the background, barely visible, was someone who looked exactly like Robert Chen. But what really made my blood freeze was when they showed testimonials from success stories, people talking about how the program had changed their lives. I recognized 3 of those faces. They were patients from my regular route, people I'd been visiting for months before they suddenly stopped answering their phones. I quit Appalachian Community Care the next week. Found a job at a clinic in town where I never have to drive up into those mountains. I still help people, but I stick to places with good cell phone coverage and plenty of neighbors. Sometimes I wonder how many other medical facilities Dr. Mitchell has set up. How many people have voluntarily walked into her program looking for help with their depression or anxiety, not knowing they'd never walk out as anything recognizably human. I don't drive mountain roads anymore, and I definitely don't do house calls. I was 26, working as a freelance wedding photographer in Nashville, when I got what I thought would be the easiest money I'd ever make. November weddings were rare, but they paid well since venues offered winter discounts. I'd been struggling to build my business after college, taking whatever gigs I could find. Most of my work was basic stuff. Family portraits, graduation photos, the occasional small wedding. So, when Jake Morrison called about documenting his daughter's traditional mountain wedding for $5,000, I didn't ask too many questions. That was more than I usually made in 2 months. Morrison explained they wanted authentic Appalachian ceremony photography. His family had been living in the Tennessee mountains for generations, and they wanted someone to capture their daughter's wedding the way their ancestors would have done it. He said they'd maintained the old ways, the traditional ceremonies and customs that most families had abandoned. It sounded like interesting work, honestly. I'd grown up in Memphis, so I didn't know much about mountain culture, but I figured it would be good for my portfolio. The wedding was set for the third weekend in November, up in the mountains about 3 hours east of Nashville. Morrison sent me directions to a trailhead off a Forest Service road. He said someone would meet me there and guide me to their family settlement. When I asked about bringing my car closer to the venue, he explained that their ancestral land was only accessible on foot. They'd preserved it exactly as their great-great-grandfathers had built it, without modern roads or power lines. I packed my professional equipment into hiking backpacks and drove up Friday morning. The trailhead was exactly where Morrison said it would be, marked by a small wooden sign that just said, Morrison Trail. A woman named Sarah was waiting for me, dressed in modern hiking clothes and carrying a large pack. She looked to be in her 30s, friendly enough, with short brown hair and the kind of tan that comes from spending a lot of time outdoors. She helped me organize my gear, and we started hiking into the forest. The trail was well maintained, clearly used regularly, winding through dense woods that were beautiful in their late fall colors. After about 2 miles, we came to what looked like a completely different world. The settlement was impressive, maybe a dozen buildings constructed using traditional methods, with hand-hewn logs and stone foundations. There were workshops, a large central meeting hall, and several smaller cabins arranged around a central area. About 50 people were moving around, preparing for the wedding ceremony. Everyone was dressed in period clothing, every 1,000 NEOZ equaler. Long dresses for the women, rough work clothes for the men, everything looking authentically historical. Some people were wearing animal skins and furs. It was like stepping back in time 200 years. Morrison greeted me enthusiastically when Sarah brought me to the main building. He was a big man, maybe in his 50s, with a thick beard and calloused hands. He showed me around the community, explaining how they'd maintained the old ways for generations. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Traditional woodworking, blacksmithing, even period-appropriate farming techniques. Everyone I met seemed genuinely excited about the wedding and proud of their heritage. The bride, Lisa, was a beautiful young woman who seemed thrilled about the ceremony. She was maybe 22 or 23, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She showed me her dress, which had been hand-sewn using traditional patterns. The groom, David, was about the same age, quiet but clearly devoted to her. They made a lovely couple, and I started getting some great shots of the preparation activities. But as I moved around the settlement with my camera, I began noticing things that didn't quite fit. There were pieces of expensive modern equipment hidden throughout the buildings. Professional lighting rigs disguised as oil lamps. What looked like small cameras positioned strategically around the central area. High-quality sound recording equipment tucked into corners and mounted under eaves. When I looked closer, I could see cables running between buildings, carefully concealed but definitely there. Morrison noticed me examining one of the hidden cameras and smiled. "We document everything for historical preservation," he explained, leading me to what appeared to be a traditional workshop. Inside, he showed me a sophisticated editing station, completely modern, with multiple monitors displaying different camera angles of the wedding preparation. "We've been filming traditional ceremonies for educational purposes. Important to preserve this knowledge for future generations." That made sense, I thought. Lots of historical societies document traditional practices. But when I glanced at the computer screens, the file names I saw weren't labeled like educational content. Names like Mountain, Wedding, Extreme, 15, and Traditional, Hunt, Premium, Content and Custom, Order, Morrison, Family. When I asked about them, Morrison's explanation got vague. He said they sometimes created special documentaries for collectors who paid well for authentic mountain culture footage. During the ceremony that evening, I started to understand what he meant. The traditional vows included elements I'd never heard in any wedding before. References to hunting together and sharing the kill and blood binding the family. The community began acting more aggressively as the ceremony progressed, chanting and stomping in ways that felt genuinely threatening rather than celebratory. What had started as quaint mountain traditions was becoming something darker and more primitive. Morrison was directing the action like a film director, signaling to family members positioned around the ceremony area. He kept checking the hidden cameras and adjusting people's positions to get better shots. I realized the bride and groom weren't acting like nervous newlyweds. They were performing, hitting their marks, and delivering lines like actors who'd rehearsed this before. The wedding feast included meat that definitely wasn't from any normal farm animal. The taste was wrong, the texture was wrong, and when I asked what it was, Morrison just smiled and said, "Traditional mountain protein." People were drinking heavily from unmarked jugs, getting louder and more aggressive as the night went on. The bride and groom kept looking at Morrison for direction, and he kept checking his watch like he was waiting for something. Around midnight, Morrison pulled me aside and whispered that tonight's honeymoon hunt would be the premium content his clients had paid for. He explained, with obvious pride, that the newlyweds would hunt and kill someone for their wealthy online audience. The victim was already chosen, a lost hiker they'd captured that morning. My job was to photograph the bride and groom's first kill as a married couple. When I said I wasn't comfortable with that and tried to leave, Morrison showed me the contracts I'd signed. Buried in the photography agreement were clauses that made me legally complicit in whatever I filmed. He'd been planning this for months, and I was trapped. "Tonight you'll photograph the authentic mountain honeymoon tradition," he said. "You're either the photographer or the subject." His family started surrounding me while he explained the real business. They'd been producing extreme content featuring actual murders for years, selling custom torture and killing videos to wealthy clients who paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for authentic mountain brutality. The settlement, the traditional wedding, even my reputation as a photographer, it was all part of an elaborate production designed to create content that felt completely real. Morrison handed me a camera and told me to start shooting. When I refused and tried to break through the crowd, the bride and groom offered to make me their honeymoon victim instead of the hiker. Lisa, who'd seemed so sweet and innocent during the day, was now grinning and holding a hunting knife. David was carrying rope and what looked like medieval torture implements. I smashed my camera equipment against the nearest building and fought my way through the crowd. Morrison was screaming about ruining months of planning and thousands of dollars in lost revenue. People were grabbing at me, trying to drag me back, but I managed to break free and run into the forest. I could hear them following, crashing through the woods behind me, but I knew the trail and they didn't expect me to run in the dark. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the nearest sheriff's office. When I tried to report what happened, the deputy looked at me like I was crazy. There was no Morrison Trail, where I said it was. No family settlement in that area. The Forest Service had no record of any traditional communities on their land. When they checked the trailhead, there was no sign and no trail. But 6 months later, I read a news article that made my blood run cold. Police had found the remains of dozens of missing hikers in the Tennessee mountains, along with professional photography equipment and business cards. My business cards, with my name and phone number. Morrison's family had been using my identity to lure photographers into their operation for years. The business cards found with the bodies were the same ones I'd been handing out all over Nashville. I moved to Oregon after that and stopped doing wedding photography entirely. To this day, I get nervous when people ask me to shoot events in rural areas. Sometimes I'll get calls from numbers with Tennessee area codes, people asking about mountain wedding photography, and I always hang up immediately. I don't know if Morrison's family is still out there, but I'm not taking any chances. And I've never been able to eat meat that I didn't cook myself since that night. Some experiences change you permanently, and there's no going back to who you were before. I'm 27 years old, and I work as a property appraiser for First Mountain Bank here in West Virginia. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it pays decent and gets me out of the office most days. November's always our busiest time. That's when we have to get all the rural property assessments done before winter makes half these mountain roads impassable. Most of the time, it's straightforward work. Someone inherits land from a relative, needs to know what it's worth for tax purposes or insurance. I drive out, take some photos, measure buildings, check comparable sales in the area. Easy money. The Martinez family called our office on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. Maria Martinez explained that they'd inherited about 300 acres from their great-aunt Rosa, who'd passed away the month before. The property included an old farmhouse and several outbuildings near Whisper Creek, about 40 minutes south of where I live. She sounded professional on the phone, educated, Not like a lot of the mountain families I usually deal with. Said they were considering selling but needed an official appraisal first. I scheduled the appointment for that Friday afternoon. The drive out was pretty typical for that part of the county. Winding mountain roads that got narrower the further you went, old mining equipment rusting in creek beds, trailers and small houses scattered wherever someone had managed to carve out a flat spot. The Martinez property was further back than most, accessible only by a gravel road that branched off from an already pretty remote state route. Maria was waiting for me at the property line when I pulled up in my truck. She was probably in her early 40s, wearing a nice business suit that seemed a little formal for tramping around mountain property, but some people dress up when they're dealing with bank business. She had dark hair pulled back in a bun and was tall, probably close to 6 feet, which isn't unusual around here where a lot of families have German or Scandinavian roots mixed in with everything else. Mr. Patterson, I'm Maria Martinez. Thank you for coming out here. Her handshake was firm, professional. I hope the drive wasn't too difficult. Not too bad, I told her, grabbing my camera and measuring tape from the truck. I've been to worse places. This your first time seeing the property? Actually, no. We've been out here a few times since Rosa passed. Had to make arrangements with the local families who've been helping maintain things. She gestured toward the farmhouse, which was visible through the trees about a quarter-mile up a dirt lane. Mountain people are good about looking after empty places. It's traditional around here. That made sense. In rural areas like this, neighbors often keep an eye on property when the owners die or move away. Prevents vandalism, makes sure pipes don't freeze, that sort of thing. As we walked toward the house, I noticed how well-maintained everything looked. The farmhouse appeared to be in good condition. The outbuildings had solid roofs, and someone had even been keeping the grass cut around the main structures. Rosa was a bit of a recluse, Maria explained as we approached the front porch. She didn't have much contact with our side of the family for the last 20 years or so. We only found out about the property when her lawyer contacted us about the will. The farmhouse was a typical 2-story mountain home, probably built in the 1940s or 50s. White clapboard siding, metal roof, stone chimney, nothing fancy but solid construction. What struck me immediately when we went inside was how clean and organized everything was. If this house had been sitting empty since Rosa died, someone had been doing more than just basic caretaking. The families have been very thorough, Maria said, noticing my expression. They've kept everything just as Rosa left it. I started my usual routine, measuring rooms, taking photos, noting the condition of floors, walls, plumbing fixtures. The house was in remarkably good shape, but something felt off. All the furniture seemed designed for unusually tall people. The kitchen table was higher than normal, the chairs had extra long seats, and I noticed that several doorways had been widened at some point. Even the bathroom fixtures seemed positioned for someone much taller than average. Rosa's family were always tall people, Maria said when I mentioned it. Mountain genetics, I suppose. But the modifications didn't look old. The doorway extensions had been done with different wood than the original construction, and the stain didn't quite match. The kitchen table looked like it had been custom-built recently, not something from Rosa's generation. I made notes about the unusual features but didn't push the issue. Families make strange choices about home modifications all the time. After about an hour inside the house, I asked to see the outbuildings. There were 3 of them: a small barn, a workshop, and a larger storage building. Maria seemed hesitant about showing me the storage building. The families use that one for keeping their things, she said, traditional mountain crafts and such. I'm not sure they'd want strangers poking around in there. I explained that I needed to assess all the structures for insurance purposes. She reluctantly agreed, producing a key from her purse. When we opened the door to the storage building, I understood why she'd been hesitant. Inside were dozens of sets of clothes, all clean and organized like a department store. Men's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing, arranged by size on makeshift racks and shelving. Each outfit had a small tag attached with what looked like names and measurements written in neat handwriting. David Chen, 5'10", medium build. Lisa Park, 5'4", small frame. Tommy Williams, 8 years old, 45 pounds. The families trade clothes, Maria said, quickly. Waste not, want not. These mountain communities have always shared resources. But these clothes weren't worn or traded. They looked like they'd been carefully preserved, some still with store tags attached. And as I looked closer, I started recognizing some of the names from missing person reports that had been in our local newspaper over the past few years. David Chen was a hiker who disappeared near the state park last spring. Lisa Park was a teacher from 2 counties over who'd vanished during a camping trip. I found something else in the building: driver's licenses and credit cards scattered in small piles on a workbench, all belonging to people who had supposedly disappeared in this area over the past 5 years. I picked up David Chen's license. The photo matched the description from the missing person reports. "Maria?" I said, turning around to confront her. "What the hell is this?" But when I looked at her, something had changed. Her posture was different, more rigid. Her voice, when she spoke, was deeper and carried an odd accent I hadn't noticed before. "The families need to understand how outsiders live," she said. "We study their possessions to learn their ways." I realized Maria wasn't entirely human. Her movements had become more mechanical, like she was concentrating hard to appear normal. Her joints seemed to bend in slightly wrong directions when she walked. "We have been very successful at integration," she continued, in that strange, too formal tone. "No one suspects when we take their places in society." She led me outside, where other family members were now waiting. They'd appeared from the woods while we were in the building. All of them were tall like Maria, but wrong in subtle ways. Too thin, with arms that seemed slightly too long for their bodies. Their faces were almost human, but not quite. The proportions were off, like someone had tried to sculpt people from memory. "We are the real mountain families," Maria explained. "We have lived here much longer than your people." She showed me a manila folder containing photographs of the Martinez family, the real people whose identities these things had stolen. A normal-looking Hispanic family posing at what looked like a campground. The man, woman, and teenage daughter all had the same warm smiles and normal human proportions. "They were camping on our territory," Maria said. "We studied them carefully before replacement." I understood then what had happened to all those missing people. These creatures had been systematically replacing families throughout the mountains, taking their identities, their property, their places in human society. Learning to mimic human behavior well enough to fool banks, government agencies, neighbors. "You will help us complete the property transfer," Maria commanded, her voice losing any pretense of human warmth. "Or we will study you as well, and someone will take your place." The other creatures had moved closer, forming a loose circle around me. I counted at least 6 of them, all staring with those almost human faces. I thought about running, but we were miles from the nearest main road, and I had no idea how fast these things could move through terrain they'd lived in for God knows how long. So I signed the appraisal paperwork. I gave the property a fair market value assessment, just like any other rural tract with buildings. I made no mention in my report of the clothing collection or the identification documents. I drove back to town and filed the paperwork with the bank like nothing had happened. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've processed property transfers for at least a dozen other families throughout this part of Appalachia. Every time, the people seem just slightly wrong, too tall, too formal in their speech, moving like they're thinking carefully about each gesture. But their paperwork is always in order, and they pay their fees on time. I still go to work every day. I still drive out to remote properties and measure buildings and take photographs. But now I'm careful to stick to the main roads, and I never go anywhere alone anymore. Because I know that if I don't show up to do my job tomorrow, something wearing my face and carrying my identification will walk into First Mountain Bank and take my place. And honestly, looking back on it now, I think that might have been the plan all along. I was 25 when I started making the rounds at craft fairs throughout eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, selling handmade silver jewelry out of the back of my Honda Civic. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was making decent money, enough to pay rent on my little apartment in Lexington and keep my student loans from completely drowning me. November was always my biggest month, with people looking for unique Christmas gifts, so I'd pack my car full of inventory and hit every small-town craft fair I could find. I'd been doing the circuit for about 3 years by then, and I knew most of the regular vendors. We'd all set up our folding tables at dawn, spend the day hawking our wares to tourists and locals, then pack up and drive to the next town. It was a good community. Jewelry makers, woodworkers, quilters, soap makers. Honest people trying to make an honest living with their hands. That's how I first met Jane Morrison at a little craft fair in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. Her family had a booth set up right across from mine, selling the most beautiful wooden bowls and woven baskets I'd ever seen. The craftsmanship was incredible, better than anything you'd find at the fancier fairs closer to Louisville or Cincinnati. The wood seemed to have this inner glow to it, and the baskets were woven with materials that felt warm to the touch, even in the chilly November air. Jane was probably in her 50s, tall and pale, with these unusual light green eyes that seemed almost gray in certain light. She was friendly enough, asking about my jewelry techniques and complimenting my work. When I asked about her family's methods, she smiled and said they'd been perfecting their craft for generations, using traditional mountain techniques passed down through their bloodline. "We make things the old way," she told me, running her fingers along one of their carved bowls, like families did for generations before all this modern nonsense took over. What really impressed me was the volume of their work. Most of us small vendors brought maybe 20 or 30 pieces to sell. The Morrisons had at least 100 items displayed, all of museum quality. When I mentioned this, Jane laughed and said their workshop back home had 10 times what they brought to the fair. "You should come see our place sometime," she offered. "We've got a proper setup, several buildings where different family members work on their specialties. You'd love it." I was intrigued, honestly. I'd been thinking about expanding beyond just jewelry, maybe learning some woodworking techniques to complement my silver pieces. Jane gave me directions to their homestead about 20 miles outside of Prestonsburg, deeper into the mountains than I'd ever ventured for business. "Fair warning, though," she said with that same smile. "We're a close family, been living on the same land for longer than most folks remember. Some people find us a bit intense." The following Tuesday, I drove out to visit them. Jane's directions led me down a series of increasingly narrow mountain roads until I was following what was barely more than a gravel path through dense forest. Just when I was starting to worry, I'd gotten lost. The trees opened up into a clearing with several wooden buildings scattered around what looked like a main farmhouse. The property was impressive. There had to be 5 or 6 workshop buildings, each dedicated to different crafts. I could see people moving between the buildings, carrying materials and finished pieces. Jane came out to greet me, looking exactly the same as she had at the fair, and introduced me to her extended family. That's when things started feeling a little strange. There were about 15 adults working around the property, and they all looked remarkably similar. Same pale complexion, same tall build, same unusual eye color as Jane. At first I figured it was just strong family genetics. You see that sometimes in isolated mountain communities where families have been intermarrying for generations. But their similarity went beyond just physical appearance. They moved in eerily similar ways, had the same speech patterns, even seemed to finish each other's sentences. When one person started explaining a wood carving technique, another family member would seamlessly continue the explanation without missing a beat, like they shared the same thoughts. Jane introduced me to her brother Samuel, her sister Ruth, her cousins Mark and Rebecca, and several others whose exact relationship to her became increasingly unclear as the afternoon went on. They all welcomed me warmly enough, showing me around their workshops with obvious pride in their work. The quality of their craftsmanship was even more impressive up close. Wooden bowls that seemed to glow with inner light, carved from wood that was almost white in color. Baskets woven with fibers I couldn't identify but felt strangely warm and soft, unlike any natural material I'd encountered. Everything had this perfect, almost machine-like precision, but clearly handmade. When I asked about their techniques and materials, they became evasive. "Family secrets," Samuel said, exchanging a glance with Jane. "Passed down through generations. We gather our materials from the deep woods, places most people don't venture." The wood did look unusual, too white, almost bleached, with a grain pattern that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon light. The fibers they used for weaving had this almost iridescent quality, like silk but with a texture I couldn't place. They insisted I stay for dinner, which Jane prepared while the others continued working. The food was unlike anything I'd ever tasted, a meat dish that was incredibly tender and had this sweet, almost honey-like flavor. When I complimented the meal, the entire family turned to look at me with those pale green eyes, sharing what seemed like a meaningful glance. "We hunt our own meat," Ruth explained. "Traditional methods are always best. We believe in using every part of what we harvest." After dinner, they suggested I stay overnight to see their evening crafting session. I was hesitant. I hadn't planned on spending the night, but my curiosity got the better of me. I'd never seen traditional mountain crafting done after dark, and they promised to show me techniques I wouldn't see anywhere else. As darkness fell, the family's behavior began to change. Their movements became more synchronized, almost ritualistic. They moved between the buildings in what looked like a practiced pattern, carrying materials and tools I hadn't seen during the day. They led me to a large workshop building that I somehow hadn't noticed during my earlier tour. Inside were dozens of human-shaped wooden frames, like mannequins but cruder, more primitive. The family began stretching what looked like animal hides over the frames, working with the same synchronized precision I'd observed all day. But as I watched more closely, I realized these weren't animal hides. The color was wrong, the texture too smooth. They were human skin, carefully preserved and treated like leather. Jane noticed my horror and turned to me with that same pleasant smile she'd worn all day. "Traditional crafting requires traditional materials," she said calmly. "We've been perfecting these techniques for longer than your people have been in these mountains." The wooden frames weren't mannequins. They were molds for making human forms. The beautiful wooden bowls I'd admired were carved from human bones, bleached white and polished smooth. The baskets were woven with human hair and sinew, processed to feel soft and warm. "Craft fairs are perfect hunting grounds," Jane continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "Traveling vendors who disappear, and no one looks for them in our territory. People just assume they moved on to the next town." Samuel gestured to another room, filled with items I now recognized: jewelry displays, pottery wheels, looms, carving tools, all taken from vendors who had come to visit their traditional workshop over the years. "We study each crafter's techniques before we harvest their materials," he explained. "Your silver work is particularly interesting. We'd like to learn your methods before we add your bones to our collection." I tried to back toward the door, but Mark was already blocking my path. The entire family was watching me now with those pale eyes, and I realized they weren't quite human. There was something wrong with their proportions, the way they tilted their heads, the way they never seemed to blink. "Don't worry," Ruth said, her voice exactly matching Jane's tone and cadence. "We make it quick. Traditional mountain hospitality." When I tried to run, I discovered they'd disabled my car while I was eating dinner. But these old mountain buildings weren't built to keep people in, and I managed to break through a window in the back of the workshop while they were gathering their tools. I ran through the forest in complete darkness, branches tearing at my clothes and face, while behind me I could hear them tracking me with what sounded like traditional mountain hunting skills. But I'd grown up hiking in Kentucky, and I knew if I could just make it to a main road, I'd have a chance. I stumbled onto Route 23 around 3 in the morning, bloody and exhausted, just as a state trooper was making his rounds. When police investigated the Morrison property the next day, they found it completely abandoned. No buildings, no workshop, no family. Just an empty clearing with a single folding table set up like a craft fair booth. On it were my business cards and a handwritten sign reading, "Visiting Vendors Welcome." I never went back to Eastern Kentucky. I still sell jewelry, but only at indoor malls now, never at rural craft fairs. Sometimes I'll see a wooden bowl or woven basket at an antique shop that has that same inner glow, that same warm texture, and I have to leave immediately. To this day, I check online obituaries for missing craft vendors. More people disappear from the circuit than you'd think. I was 31 when I started working as an estate sale coordinator for Peaceful Transitions up in West Virginia. Honestly, it wasn't a job I ever thought I'd end up doing, but after my divorce and losing my marketing position in Charleston, I needed something that paid decent and didn't require me to sit in an office all day pretending to care about quarterly reports. Peaceful Transitions helped families clean out properties after someone died. We'd handle everything from getting appraisals done to organizing the actual sales. Most of the time it was pretty straightforward work, just sad. You'd go through someone's entire life that had been packed into boxes and hope their family got a fair price for whatever was left behind. The Morrison estate came across my desk in November, and right away I could tell it was going to be different. 2,000 acres of mountain property, plus this massive Victorian mansion that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. The deceased was Eleanor Morrison, 97 years old, who'd apparently lived as a complete recluse for the last 30 years. No apparent heirs, no close family, just this enormous estate that needed to be liquidated according to her will. My supervisor, Janet, seemed almost relieved to hand the file over to me. She said the previous coordinator, a woman named Jennifer, had quit suddenly after starting the preliminary work. Just walked out one day and never came back, which seemed weird, but people leave jobs for all sorts of reasons. The Morrison mansion was about an hour-and-a-half drive into the mountains from our office in Beckley. The first time I saw it, I understood why Eleanor had become a recluse. The place was absolutely stunning but completely isolated. You had to drive down this winding dirt road for maybe 20 minutes after leaving the main highway, and there wasn't another house visible in any direction. The mansion itself was 3 stories of dark wood and ornate Victorian details, surrounded by gardens that had clearly been maintained until recently. Inside, every room was packed with antiques, artwork, and what looked like decades' worth of collected furniture and decorative items. It was going to take weeks just to catalog everything properly. What struck me as odd from the beginning was how organized Eleanor's personal papers were. Most elderly people we dealt with had scattered documents, incomplete records, maybe a shoebox full of important papers mixed in with grocery lists and old Christmas cards. But Eleanor's office was like something you'd see in a law firm. Filing cabinets full of meticulously organized folders, each one labeled and dated. As I started going through her records to understand the scope of the estate, I kept finding references to something called the Territory Compact. At first, I assumed it was some kind of historical document related to the family's land holdings. The Morrison family had apparently been major landowners in this part of West Virginia since the 1800s, so it made sense they'd have old territorial agreements or property deeds. But the more I read through Eleanor's files, the more I realized this was something much more extensive and much more recent than historical land records. The compact described what it called traditional territorial arrangements between the Morrison family and various mountain communities in the region. According to these documents, certain families had been given permission to live traditionally on Morrison land in exchange for providing natural resource management services. Eleanor had been making regular payments to dozens of families for decades, not small amounts either. We're talking thousands of dollars every month going back to the 1,950 seconds. But here's what made my skin crawl. These weren't payments for farming or logging or any kind of normal land management. The invoices were labeled as compensation for acquisition services and inventory processing. I found detailed spreadsheets that looked like business records, except instead of products or services, they were tracking missing persons. Each entry included a person's name, their estimated net worth, and something called a processing location. I remember sitting in Eleanor's office, looking at these records, and feeling this sick realization wash over me. Eleanor Morrison hadn't been running some kind of historical preservation program or traditional land management operation. She'd been legally laundering murder for 3 generations. Every antique, every piece of jewelry, every expensive item I was supposed to catalog and sell, it all came from people who disappeared in these mountains over the past 70 years. The estate sale I was organizing was essentially a decades-long accumulation of stolen property from hundreds of unsolved murders. I was still trying to process what I'd found when I heard voices upstairs. The mansion was supposed to be empty. I had the only key, and I'd locked the front door behind me when I came in. But there were definitely people talking somewhere on the second floor. I could hear at least 3 different voices, all men, having what sounded like a business meeting. I crept up the main staircase as quietly as I could and hid behind this enormous antique armoire in the hallway. The voices were coming from Eleanor's bedroom, and I could hear them clearly now. Eleanor's death creates significant complications for the operation, one of them was saying. He had the kind of precise, educated accent you'd expect from an expensive lawyer. The Territory Compact requires continuous administrative oversight. The Mountain families are becoming anxious about maintaining their legal protections. What about the estate coordinator? Another voice asked. She's already seen most of the documentation. It might be simpler to bring her into the arrangement rather than starting over with someone new. I felt like I was going to throw up. They were talking about me. The first voice continued. The families have very specific territorial requirements. They've been operating under Morrison protection for generations. Without proper legal framework, they'll be exposed to law enforcement scrutiny. We need someone who can manage property transfers, handle identity documentation, and coordinate with local authorities when necessary. I tried to back away from the door, but the old floorboards creaked under my feet. The conversation stopped immediately, and I heard footsteps coming toward the hallway. "Miss Patterson?" The voice was calm, almost friendly. "We know you're out there. Please join us. We have a business proposition that I think you'll find very interesting." 3 men in expensive suits were waiting for me in Eleanor's bedroom. The one who'd spoken introduced himself as attorney Marcus Webb from a law firm in Charleston that I'd never heard of. He was maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that rich people wear when they're about to ruin your life. "Please, have a seat," Webb said, gesturing to an antique chair. "I apologize for the surprise meeting, but Eleanor's death has created some time-sensitive legal issues that require immediate attention." He opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Eleanor Morrison was more than just a wealthy recluse, Miss Patterson. She was the legal administrator for what we call the Territory Compact, a framework that has protected traditional mountain communities in this region for over a century and a half. Webb explained that I hadn't stumbled onto evidence of random murders. I'd discovered a carefully organized criminal enterprise that had been operating under legal protection since before the Civil War. The mountain families weren't just random killers. They were organized communities of people who'd rejected modern society and survived by systematically hunting and robbing travelers, hikers, and anyone else who wandered into their territorial boundaries. Eleanor's role was essential, Webb continued. She processed their acquisitions through legal channels. Missing persons reports were misdirected or closed. Stolen property was laundered through estate sales and auctions. The families could maintain their traditional lifestyle without worrying about modern legal complications. He showed me contracts that would make me Eleanor's replacement. I'd become the legal guardian of 12 different traditional communities scattered throughout the Appalachian region. My job would be coordinating between law enforcement, local government, and these feral communities to ensure their business operations could continue without interference. When I told him absolutely not, that I was going to walk out of there and report everything to the FBI, Webb's friendly smile never wavered. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder with my name on it. Inside were photographs of my apartment building in Charleston, pictures of my car in the parking lot, photos of me grocery shopping, getting gas, walking to my mailbox. There were detailed maps showing my daily routine, my work schedule, even pictures of my elderly parents at their retirement community in Florida. The mountain families are extremely protective of their business arrangements, Webb said casually. They don't respond well to threats against their livelihood. The previous estate coordinator, Jennifer, discovered that lesson rather dramatically. He showed me crime scene photographs that I wish I could forget. Jennifer's body had been arranged in some kind of ritualistic display deep in the forest. She'd been posed among old bones and rotting clothing, apparently the remains of other people who'd threatened the operation over the years. Jennifer thought she could expose the compact to federal authorities, Webb explained. The families took that as a personal attack on their survival. They can be quite territorial when they feel threatened. I signed the contracts. What choice did I have? Webb handed me keys to Eleanor's office in downtown Beckley and explained my new responsibilities. I'd coordinate between the mountain communities and local law enforcement to ensure missing persons investigations were handled appropriately. I'd process stolen property through legitimate auction houses and estate sales. Most importantly, I'd maintain the legal frameworks that kept these communities protected from modern law enforcement. The Morrison family had created a system that made murder into a legally protected traditional practice. That was 8 months ago. I've been running this operation ever since, and I've learned that the Territory Compact isn't just limited to West Virginia. There are coordinators like me managing feral communities across the entire Appalachian region, from Georgia all the way up to Pennsylvania. We have monthly conference calls to coordinate between territories and share information about law enforcement activities. I still live in Charleston, still drive the same car, still shop at the same grocery store. But now I know that every missing hiker, every disappeared camper, every person who vanishes in these mountains is probably part of a centuries-old murder enterprise that I help manage. And I know that if I ever try to leave or expose what's happening, I'll end up arranged in the forest just like Jennifer. The families are always watching, always territorial, always hungry. And legally, I'm the one who protects them. I was 24 when I started working as a delivery driver for Mountain Fresh Foods out in eastern Kentucky. Wasn't exactly my dream job, but after getting laid off from the factory in Lexington, I needed something that paid decent and didn't require me sitting in an office all day. The company specialized in grocery deliveries to isolated communities way back in the mountains, places where regular stores couldn't make a profit running routes. Most of these communities were an hour or more off the main highways, connected by logging roads and old mining access routes that half the time weren't even on GPS maps. November was always my busiest month. People in those remote areas knew winter could cut them off for weeks at a time, so they'd stock up heavy on canned goods, frozen meat, propane, anything that would keep them fed and warm until spring. I'd been doing the route for about 8 months by then, and had gotten to know most of my regular customers pretty well. Mountain folk are cautious with outsiders at first, but once they trust you, they treat you like family. That's why I didn't think much of it when dispatch gave me a new address in early November. Birch Hollow Community Center, they called it. The order was massive, enough groceries for maybe 200 people. My supervisor, Janet, said it was some kind of extended family compound that had just started up. Religious group or something, she told me. They pay in cash, always on time. Good customers. The GPS led me down Highway 23 for about 30 miles, then onto a state road that got narrower and more winding with each mile. After that, I turned onto what looked like an old logging road. The further I drove, the more overgrown everything got. Tree branches scraped against my delivery truck, and more than once I had to stop and move fallen logs out of the way. An hour after leaving the main road, I was starting to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn. Then the trees opened up into a clearing, and there it was, a large wooden building that looked like it had been built recently. Clean lumber, new metal roofing, fresh gravel parking area. It looked more like a warehouse than any community center I'd ever seen, but the address matched what was on my delivery sheet. A woman came out to meet me at the loading dock. She was maybe 40, wearing clean jeans and a flannel shirt, normal looking as could be. "You must be Tom," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Carol. Thank you so much for making the drive out here." She was professional, friendly, and paid in crisp new bills just like Janet had said. But while I was unloading the groceries, something bothered me. The place was completely silent. No voices, no sounds of activity, nothing. When I asked Carol about the size of their community, she just smiled and said, "We care for extended family. Lots of folks to feed." Over the next 3 months, I made regular deliveries to Birch Hollow every 2 weeks. Carol was always there to meet me, always paid on time, and the orders kept getting bigger. But I never saw another soul. Not once. The building stayed silent as a tomb every time I visited, and Carol never offered to show me around or introduce me to anyone else. In February, things started getting strange. Carol began adding odd items to her grocery orders. Raw meat, but not normal cuts. Massive quantities of liver, kidneys, hearts, organ meat by the hundreds of pounds. When I asked about it, she explained that some family members had dietary restrictions. "Old family recipes," she said. "Tradition, you know." She also started ordering children's vitamins and baby formula. But when I mentioned that I had a 2-year-old nephew and asked about the kids in their community, Carol got defensive real quick. "We prefer to keep family matters private," she said, and changed the subject. I began staying longer during deliveries, trying to catch a glimpse of other community members. That's when I started hearing the sounds coming from the forest behind the building. Low, rhythmic chanting that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. The voices were wrong somehow, too deep, lasting way too long without anyone taking a breath. When Carol noticed me listening, she quickly guided me back toward my truck. "Evening prayers," she explained, "old family traditions from the home country." But the chanting followed a pattern that made my skin crawl. 3 deep voices in unison, then complete silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then, something that sounded disturbingly like screaming. Not human screaming, something else entirely. March came in with a late snowstorm, and when I arrived at Birch Hollow for my regular delivery, Carol wasn't there to meet me. I waited in my truck for over an hour, engine running for heat, watching the snow pile up on my windshield. Finally, I decided to check the building. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and called for Carol, but my voice just echoed back at me. The building was completely empty, except for what I found in the main room. Enormous piles of bones. Human bones mixed with animal bones, all cleaned and sorted by type. Skulls arranged in perfect circles around stone altars that definitely hadn't been there during my previous deliveries. I found Carol's clothes folded neatly on a wooden table, but no sign of Carol herself. That's when I heard footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate steps that were way too heavy for any human. The chanting started again, but now it was coming from directly above me. I looked out the window and saw figures moving between the trees. They were tall and pale, with arms that hung too low and heads tilted at impossible angles. But they wore human clothes: jeans, flannel shirts, work boots. They moved with obvious intelligence, but their bodies were wrong in every way that mattered. One of them spotted me watching through the window and called out in Carol's exact voice, "Tom, come help us with the evening prayers." But Carol was nowhere to be seen. The voice was coming from something that was definitely not human. More figures emerged from the forest, surrounding the building. They all started calling my name, but in different voices. Voices I recognized from my other delivery stops. Customers I'd been talking with for months, people I'd grown to like and trust. They had perfect human speech, but their bodies moved like predators. Too tall, joints bending backward, skin that looked gray and stretched tight over bones that were shaped all wrong. I ran for my truck while they closed in around the building. As I started the engine, they pressed against the windows, still talking in those familiar voices. "Tom, don't leave. We need to discuss next month's order. You've been so good to us, Tom. Stay for dinner. The family wants to meet you properly." I floored it down that narrow logging road, branches scraping and snapping against my truck. In my rearview mirror, I could see dozens of those wrong-shaped things following me, but they stayed on foot and I was able to outrun them. I quit my delivery job the next day. Told Janet I was moving back to Lexington for family reasons. She didn't ask questions. 6 months later, I ran into my replacement at a gas station. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in half that time. When I asked how the job was going, he got quiet for a minute, then said, "Did you ever deliver to some place called Birch Hollow?" I told him I had. "They found my truck abandoned on that logging road last week," he said. "I don't remember how I got home. I don't remember much of anything from that delivery." That's when I did some digging. Turns out Mountain Fresh Foods had been delivering to 43 different community centers throughout eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. All of them in remote locations, all of them ordering massive quantities of food. And every single driver who worked those routes for more than 6 months had eventually disappeared. Every driver except me. I still don't know why they let me go. Maybe because I never got out of my truck during those first few deliveries, never tried to explore or ask too many questions. Maybe because I ran when I had the chance instead of sticking around to investigate. I moved back to Louisville after that and got a job at a hardware store. Safe, normal work with regular customers and a building full of people during business hours. I've never been back to Eastern Kentucky, and I never will be. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I can still hear that chanting. 3 deep voices, then silence, then screaming. And I wonder how many of those community centers are still operating, and how many delivery drivers are still making their rounds, not knowing that some customers aren't customers at all. They're something else, entirely. Wearing human voices like masks, waiting patiently for the right moment to invite you in for evening prayers. I'm 35 now, and I've been working as a social worker for the Kentucky Department of Child Services for about 8 years. Most people think my job is all paperwork and court hearings, but honestly, a lot of it is driving out to places that don't show up on GPS and checking on kids who live so far back in the mountains that their nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. I grew up in Lexington, so when I first started this job, I had no idea what I was getting into with these rural cases. But after a few years, I thought I'd seen everything. Neglect cases, abuse situations, families living without running water or electricity. I figured I could handle whatever came my way. In November of 2019, I got assigned a case that seemed pretty routine at first. Anonymous tip about the Patterson family, 5 children, supposedly living in what the caller described as subhuman conditions. What made it weird was that instead of giving me an address, the report just had GPS coordinates. That should have been my first red flag. But my supervisor, Karen, said it was probably just someone who didn't know the actual address. Happens more than you'd think out in Daniel Boone National Forest. The coordinates put the location about 2 hours southeast of my office, deep in the mountains near the Tennessee border. Karen told me it was probably a false report. We get those sometimes from neighbors with grudges or family members trying to cause trouble. But state protocol requires that we investigate every tip within 72 hours, no matter how sketchy it sounds. So, on a Tuesday morning, I loaded up my Honda Civic with my usual gear, camera, forms, emergency supplies, and headed into the mountains. The drive took me through some of the most remote country I'd ever seen. After about an hour and a half, I was on single-lane gravel roads with drop-offs that made my stomach clench every time I looked over the edge. My phone had lost signal about 30 minutes earlier, but my GPS was still working, so I kept following the little blue dot deeper into the forest. When I got as close as I could by car, the GPS showed I still had about 3 miles to hike. I parked at what looked like an old logging road and started walking. The trail was well maintained, which surprised me. Most of these remote family compounds are accessed by overgrown paths that are barely visible. This one looked like it got regular use. After about 45 minutes of hiking, I started hearing voices up ahead. Not unusual, probably just the family I was there to check on. But as I got closer, something felt off about the conversation. The voices were too controlled, too professional. Like people talking at work, not a family just living their lives. I slowed down and tried to approach quietly. Through the trees, I could see a clearing with several structures. Looked like a mix of log cabins and newer prefab buildings. But what really caught my attention were the vehicles. 3 black SUVs with government plates, parked in a neat line under some camouflage netting. That definitely wasn't normal for a child welfare case. I was still trying to figure out what I was looking at when a woman in tactical gear stepped out from behind a tree about 10 feet to my left. She had been watching me the whole time. "Miss Walker," she said, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. She knew my name. "You're not supposed to be here." She showed me a federal ID, Agent Rebecca Torres, Department of Health and Human Services, Child Development Research Division. I'd never heard of that division, but the ID looked real enough. Torres was probably in her early 40s, with short gray hair and the kind of steady eye contact that makes you feel like you're being evaluated. "I'm here on a child welfare investigation," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Anonymous tip about the Patterson family." Torres nodded like she'd been expecting this. "Miss Walker, what you've stumbled onto is a classified research site. We're conducting a longitudinal study on alternative child-rearing methodologies in isolated environments." I stared at her. What does that mean, exactly? She gestured for me to follow her to a small observation station that had been built into the hillside overlooking the settlement. Through one-way glass, I could see the clearing more clearly. There were children down there, 5 of them, ranging in age from maybe 8 to 14. But something was wrong with how they moved. "These children are part of a federal program studying primitive socialization patterns," Torres explained. "We're documenting how human development progresses without modern social conditioning." The kids below weren't playing like normal children. They were moving through the clearing in formation, communicating through hand signals and clicking sounds. As I watched, the oldest boy pointed to something in the tree line, and the others immediately spread out in what looked like a hunting pattern. "How long have they been here?" I asked. The current group has been in the program for 6 years. We started when they were toddlers. I felt sick. Where are their parents? Torres pointed to 2 adults who emerged from one of the cabins. They were dressed in primitive clothing, animal skins, handmade tools, but they moved with military precision. Those are their assigned caregivers, highly trained specialists in survival techniques and child development. I watched the 12-year-old boy track something through the underbrush. When he emerged, he was carrying a rabbit that he'd killed with what looked like a sharpened stick. The other children gathered around him, examining his technique. They moved like a pack, with perfect coordination and no wasted motion. "This is child abuse," I said. Torres turned to look at me. "Miss Walker, these children have survival skills that would put most Navy SEALs to shame. They can track, hunt, build shelter, navigate by stars, and work as a perfect team unit. Traditional education creates weak, dependent civilians. We're raising the next generation of American soldiers." The children below had started butchering the rabbit with stone tools. They worked with quiet efficiency, each child handling a specific task without any verbal communication. It was terrifying how competent they were. "I want to speak with them," I said. "That's not possible. These children are national security assets. They cannot be contaminated with civilian contact." I started to argue, but Torres held up her hand. "Janet, may I call you Janet? I think you're misunderstanding your role here. You weren't sent here by accident." She pulled out a tablet and showed me my case assignment. It had been filed directly from a federal office in Washington, not from our usual state channels. Someone had been monitoring our department's incoming tips and had specifically assigned me to this case. "We've been watching you for months," Torres said. "Your background check, psychological profile, financial situation, everything suggests you might be suitable for recruitment." I felt cold. Recruitment for what? Project Wilderness needs qualified child development specialists, people who understand that traditional family structures create weakness. Your student loan debt, your mother's medical bills, your lack of significant personal relationships, all of these factors indicate that you could benefit from a career change. She was right about all of it. I was drowning in debt, my mom's cancer treatments were bankrupting both of us, and I hadn't had a serious relationship in 3 years. But the idea of being part of this program made me want to run. "All you have to do is file a report saying you found no evidence of children at these coordinates," Torres continued. "Then we'll discuss your future with the program. Starting salary is $120,000 annually, plus full medical benefits and student loan forgiveness." I looked down at the children again. They had finished with the rabbit and were now practicing some kind of combat drill, moving through the trees like shadows. They were deadly efficient, but they were still just kids. Kids who had been stolen from their families and turned into weapons. "No," I said. "I'm going to report this." Torres smiled. "To whom? Your supervisor, who approved this assignment? The state attorney general, whose office coordinates with our program? The FBI, who provides security for our research sites?" She called out something in a language I didn't recognize, and the 2 primitive caregivers looked up at us. They weren't primitive at all. They were special operations soldiers maintaining deep cover. They started moving toward the observation station. "The children need to practice tracking human targets," Torres said casually. "Adult supervision ensures they glance star, develop proper technique without causing permanent damage." Usually, I agreed to file the false report. What else could I do? Torres walked me back to my car and handed me a new case assignment for the following month. Different coordinates, different project. I've been recruiting social workers for federal programs for 2 years now. Looking back, I realized that Project Wilderness was just one small part of something much bigger. There are dozens of classified operations throughout Appalachia, research sites, training facilities, testing grounds. Every time I try to quit, they remind me that I know where the children are, and they know where my mother lives.